The early morning light cast a soft glow over the ranger station parking lot, where four friends gathered for what they promised would be their greatest adventure yet. Nathan Collins, the unofficial leader of the group, adjusted the straps of his heavy backpack, the laminated map poking from the side pocket, a symbol of his meticulous planning. Jasmine Torres offered an encouraging smile as she checked her medical kit one last time, her training as a nurse giving her a quiet confidence that reassured the others. Eric Malone leaned against his old SUV, testing the laces on his battered boots, his years guiding others through Idaho's rugged terrain showing in every calm movement. Shannon Greene bounced on her heels with restless energy, her eyes darting to the trailhead sign that warned of closures, her mind halfway between excitement and worry about the risk they were taking. They were not first-timers fumbling with gear or unsure of their fitness. Each had spent years exploring mountains, planning trips and swapping survival tips around campfires. Nathan, in particular, prided himself on knowing the wild in ways others only dreamed of, spending long weekends cataloging rare alpine flora for his environmental science program. Jasmine had learned to manage injuries in places where ambulances never went, growing confident in tending scrape sprains, and even a deep gash or two when needed. Eric had built a reputation among locals in Boise for getting even the most clueless tourists safely up and back down the Rockies. Shannon, the youngest of the four, carried the gentle patience of a teacher, but matched the rest of them in stubborn grit, refusing to be underestimated because she taught third graders for a living. The Cascade Mountains loomed ahead, shrouded in early fog that had begun to lift in ribbons as the sun crept higher, revealing deep green slopes dotted with jagged outcrops. Their plan was simple on paper, but ambitious in execution. They would take an old logging road that snaked away from the main path, avoiding the crowded summer routes swarming with families and shouting teenagers. They had read enough trip reports to know it was marked as closed and potentially unsafe, but they brushed it off as bureaucratic overkill. Nathan insisted they would be fine if they stayed alert and respected the terrain. The ranger at the station had offered them a politely skeptical nod and told them to stay on the posted paths, but Nathan had mumbled an agreement he never planned to honor. They set off at a brisk pace, the gravel crunching under sturdy boots, their breath forming faint clouds in the cool air. Conversation was easy at first, a welcome distraction from the heavy packs digging into their shoulders. Nathan lectured cheerfully about the alpine plants they might see at higher elevations, describing tiny flowers clinging to life in rocky crags, each a testament to evolution's ingenuity. Jasmine countered with dry humor about who would be the first to twist an ankle and force them to practice wilderness first aid for real. Eric offered navigation tips drawn from years of guiding tourists who had no idea how to read a compass. Shannon asked questions, teasing her older friends about their big talk and promising she would be the last one standing when the day was over. The unmarked trail was narrow and overgrown, forcing them into single file as it twisted through towering Douglas firs and patches of thick underbrush. The scent of wet earth filled their lungs, and the silence of the forest seemed to press in on them the farther they went. They crossed a small stream on slippery rocks, laughing at near misses and catching each other's packs to keep anyone from falling in. It felt like adventure in its purest form, but beneath the laughter was an unspoken edge of awareness that they were choosing to ignore posted warnings, and that no one else would be following them. Eric paused at one point to study the sky, frowning at the way high clouds gathered over distant peaks, but Nathan waved off concerns about weather, insisting it would hold. As the sun rose higher and sweat trickled down their backs, they found a small clearing where they dropped packs to catch their breath. Jasmine checked her kit again, making sure bandages were dry and antiseptic bottles sealed. Nathan pulled out his notebook, the waterproof pages already filled with careful notes about plants he had seen so far. He explained he needed to collect a few samples that were extremely rare and technically off-limits without a permit. Jasmine looked at him sharply, warning that they could face fines if caught, but Nathan brushed it off with a cavalier smile and a promise that no one would ever know. Eric listened without comment, but the tension was clear in the way he tightened the laces on his boots before announcing they needed to keep moving to make camp before dark. By early afternoon, they had pushed deep into the range, the signs of human use fading behind them until the only marks were faint animal trails crisscrossing the forest floor. The ground grew steeper, the air thinner and cooler, and conversation fell away except for the occasional murmur of directions or reminders to drink water. Nathan led confidently, reading the terrain and ignoring the uneasy way Eric scanned the thickening clouds. Shannon trailed just behind Jasmine, her pack feeling heavier than ever, but refusing to complain out loud. She had waited months for this trip, dreaming of proving herself among these more experienced hikers. As they pressed on, the trees gave way to a rocky slope with commanding views of the valley below. They stopped to admire it, feeling small but alive, the whole world at their feet, and no sense of danger yet on the horizon. They could not know that this choice would seal their fate. This unmarked path, which promised solitude and discovery, would soon become a labyrinth with no clear exit. The closed sign they had ignored at dawn was not some bureaucratic annoyance, but the last clear warning they would see. By the time they realized they were too far to turn back easily, the sky would shift from friendly blue to ominous gray, and the first hint of trouble would send them scrambling for cover they might not find. For now, they were four friends standing on the threshold of an adventure that felt bold and pure, and free blind to the truth that nature owed them no mercy and that every step forward was one step deeper into a trap they had set for themselves. By late afternoon, the mood had shifted from playful to tense as clouds gathered thick and low over the peaks ahead. The four hikers felt the temperature drop quickly, and the wind picked up rattling branches and sending pine needles skittering across the narrow trail. Eric paused to study the sky, the trained guide in him sensing trouble in the layered gray that deepened by the minute. Nathan insisted they could make it to the next ridge before anything serious hit, dismissing Eric's caution with a frustrated wave. Jasmine bit her lip, glancing at the thickening gloom and deciding to stay silent for now. Shannon felt her pulse quicken with unease, clutching her hiking poles tightly and wondering if they should have just turned back at the first sign of danger that morning. They pressed on, but the storm hit them harder and faster than any of them expected. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and cold rain pelted their jackets, soaking them in minutes despite their gear. The forest darkened so much it felt like twilight, even though it was barely past 3 in the afternoon. The trail turned slick with mud, and small rivulets of water carved channels down the slope. They stumbled and cursed boots slipping and heavy packs tugging at their balance with each misstep. Eric, trying to keep them moving at a careful pace, planted his foot wrong on a wet slab of rock and let out a sharp cry as he twisted and went down hard. Jasmine rushed to his side while Nathan and Shannon dropped their gear, rain flattening their hair to their faces as they tried to assess the damage. Eric winced and clenched his jaw, breathing heavily as Jasmine examined his ankle with practiced hands. The joint was already swelling, and the pain was sharp enough that he could not put weight on it. Jasmine looked at the others and announced with grim certainty that it was a bad sprain at the very least, possibly worse, and that Eric would need to rest it immediately. Nathan muttered under his breath and stared up at the sky rain trickling down his nose, clearly calculating the loss of time and the added danger. Shannon sat heavily on a rock, shaking from more than cold, watching the forest blur behind the curtains of rain that showed no sign of stopping. They knew they had to find shelter quickly before hypothermia became a new threat. They limped their way into a small rock alcove half hidden by ferns, the only dry space for yards in any direction. Nathan and Jasmine helped Eric sit, his face pale and tight with pain, while Shannon dropped her pack with a wet thud and began unpacking the emergency blanket and food. Water pooled at their feet and soaked their knees as they settled in every movement, uncomfortable in the cramped, uneven space. They shared protein bars and sips of water, while Jasmine checked Eric's ankle again and tightened a makeshift brace around it with gauze from her kit. The mood had curdled into something brittle, every small sound from the storm outside making them flinch, and the fear they had been trying to laugh off all day now sat between them like a fifth companion they could not ignore. The rain did not stop, but slackened into a cold, steady drizzle that drummed on the rocks above them in a maddening rhythm. Nathan finally spoke up in a low, urgent voice, insisting they could still make up time in the morning if the weather cleared. Jasmine gave him a look of pure disbelief, telling him to look at Eric and see reality. Eric closed his eyes, breathing carefully, trying to hide the pain that was clearly radiating from his ankle and up his leg. Shannon hugged her knees to her chest and listened to them argue, wishing she was anywhere but there, and resenting the promise she had made to herself not to cry on this trip. They all knew without saying it that they could not go back the way they had come without risking further injury, and that their only chance would be to wait out the weather and hope Eric could walk enough to keep moving. The night came early, under the thick cloud cover, and the temperature dropped even more. They huddled in the alcove with the emergency blanket draped over the four of them, their body heat the only defense against the chill that seemed to seep from the wet rocks. Rain dripped in cold beads from the edge of the stone ceiling, tapping their shoulders and necks in small, merciless reminders of their situation. Jasmine dozed fitfully against Eric's shoulder, waking every so often to check his breathing and adjust the brace that kept swelling at bay. Nathan stared out into the blackness beyond the alcove, mind spinning with regret and frustration, while Shannon closed her eyes tightly and tried to remember the warmth of her classroom in Spokane, the smell of crayons and floor polish, and the voices of children asking her for help with their reading. When dawn finally broke the next day, the rain had slackened to a cold drizzle that soaked their gear and chilled their bones. The light filtering through the dripping canopy was gray and thin, giving no sense of comfort. Nathan woke first his back, stiff from a night on uneven stone, and blinked at the sight of the others huddled like discarded dolls beneath the emergency blanket. Jasmine stirred her eyes hollow and red from crying she pretended she had not done. Eric groaned as he tried to shift biting back curses as the pain lanced up his leg. Shannon shivered silently in the corner, arms wrapped tightly around her knees. They all felt the weight of the night pressing on them even though it was over. No one wanted to speak first because no one wanted to admit how bad things had gotten. They packed in silence, fingers clumsy from cold each movement, making the situation feel more real. Jasmine checked Eric's ankle and sighed at the bruising that had spread into an angry black and purple map of pain. He would not be walking far today without help. Shannon tried to lighten the mood by talking about what they would do when they got home, but her voice cracked and no one answered. Nathan busied himself with his map, frowning at the smeared ink that had bled across the page during the storm. Critical landmarks were blurred into shapeless blobs paths, lost under an abstract watercolor of disaster. The others watched him, but no one spoke, knowing they had no better ideas. They ate their meager breakfast in near silence, cold protein bars that stuck in their throats without water. Nathan insisted they had to keep moving despite the injuries and ruined map. Jasmine tried to argue that they should stay put and wait for rescue, reasoning that at least they were somewhat sheltered. Eric said nothing, but his clenched jaw showed he hated feeling useless. Shannon looked between them and felt the cold fear bloom in her chest. She wanted to agree with Jasmine, but she also could not bear the thought of being found dead in that alcove. Nathan grew frustrated and snapped at Jasmine for wanting to give up so easily, accusing her of not understanding how these situations worked. His words stung, but Jasmine only shook her head, slowly, blinking back tears. By late morning, they had chosen to move. Eric leaned on Nathan heavily as they made their way down the slick trail, each step a small torture that drew involuntary gasps from him. Jasmine walked behind them, trying to steady Eric when Nathan stumbled under his weight. Shannon took point with what was left of the map, squinting at it and trying to decipher any recognizable feature through the ruined ink. The forest felt oppressively quiet, the only sound the squelch of wet boots in mud and the soft hiss of the lingering drizzle. Each time they stopped for breath, they felt the cold settle deeper into their soaked clothes. The only thing worse than the pain was the uncertainty growing with every step. Around midday, they rested under a dense stand of fir trees, grateful for the relative dryness. Shannon blinked through tears she tried to hide, watching the shapes of the trees blur and swim in her vision. She thought she saw lights flickering between the trunks in the distance, pinpricks of white that bobbed and vanished. She blinked again, and they were gone. She told the others, and Nathan scoffed that it was just reflections or wishful thinking. Jasmine asked quietly if maybe there were other hikers nearby, but no one really believed it. Eric pressed his head back against the trunk, breathing shallowly, and told them to move on without him. No one answered him. As they prepared to move again, Nathan realized the compass was gone, probably lost when they scrambled for shelter the night before. Jasmine cursed under her breath and closed her eyes. They tried to use the smeared map, but it offered them no help. Nathan insisted he could still find the ridge they were aiming for. He set off with forced confidence, leading them through tangled brush and over slick rocks. The others followed because they had no better plan. Eric leaned heavily on Jasmine, now wincing with each step, his pride dissolving into raw pain. Shannon walked at the rear, eyes scanning the silent woods for the lights she thought she saw, praying she would see them again, and that this time they would mean help was coming. They pushed on through dense underbrush as the drizzle finally faded to a dull mist that clung to their clothes and hair, soaking them to the skin and chilling them with every slow mile. Nathan led stubbornly, squinting at the ruined map and pretending he could still see something useful there. He chose to follow a barely visible indentation in the ground that twisted along a ridgeline and convinced himself it was a forgotten trail. Jasmine stayed close to Eric, her arm under his shoulders as he limped and grimaced with every step. Shannon followed last, her eyes darting to the fading light filtering through the towering pines, afraid of how quickly afternoon shadows were swallowing the forest. They did not speak much because each word seemed to cost more energy than they could spare. The faint path dropped down sharply toward a creek bed choked with slick stones and fallen logs. Nathan stopped at the edge of the bank and looked back at them with a mix of pride and worry that was impossible to miss. He insisted this route would save them time, offering a shortcut back toward the main trail that he claimed he recognized from the contour lines on the map before it was ruined. Jasmine stared at the descent with open skepticism, but said nothing, too tired to argue. Eric shook his head once, but lacked the strength to resist, knowing they had little choice if they wanted to keep moving. Shannon stayed silent, but clenched her jaw, trying not to let her fear show as she watched Nathan pick his way down first. The descent was a slow nightmare of slipping feet and clutching branches. Wet leaves and moss-covered rocks betrayed every step, sending boots skidding and legs flailing for balance. Jasmine cursed under her breath as she half-carried Eric down the slope, feeling her shoulders scream in protest. Nathan tried to direct them, shouting back instructions that were lost in the brush and the steady roar of water ahead. Shannon moved with deliberate caution, placing her feet carefully and fighting the urge to cry when the mud sucked at her boots and threatened to drag her down. When they finally reached the creek, it was swollen from the storm, rushing brown water frothing over sharp stones and downed logs. The sound drowned out their voices and made them shout to be heard, turning every exchange into an argument whether they meant it or not. They paused to catch their breath, sweat and rain mingling on their faces as they considered the next move. Nathan insisted they could follow the creek downstream until it bent toward the valley floor, where he swore they would reconnect with an old logging road. Jasmine snapped that they should stay put and build a real shelter, warning that pushing Eric any farther would only make things worse. Eric listened with eyes half-closed, pain etched into every line of his face, saying nothing but breathing hard. Shannon sat on a rock, hugging her knees, watching the swirling water with glassy eyes as fear threatened to swallow her whole. She tried to think of her students back in Spokane, the safe warmth of the classroom, anything but the icy water and the hopeless expressions around her. They finally chose to continue because there was no other choice that felt better. The creek was a siren song promising a clear direction, even though it was treacherous and slow. Nathan led them along the edge, feet slipping on wet stones as he used fallen branches for balance. Jasmine followed with Eric, struggling to keep them both upright while whispering reassurances she did not believe. Shannon trailed behind, carefully testing each step and jumping at every splash or crack of a branch underfoot. At one point, Nathan lost his footing entirely and went down hard, sliding several feet before Jasmine caught his arm and hauled him back to the bank. They stared at each other with raw anger before Nathan mumbled an apology no one heard over the roar of the creek. As daylight began to fail, the air turned biting cold and the forest seemed to close in around them. They stopped to set a hasty camp on a narrow strip of muddy ground above the waterline. Eric could barely move by then, his face pale and drawn, as Jasmine inspected his ankle again, shaking her head at the way the swelling had spread. She did her best to stabilize it, wrapping it tighter while fighting back tears of frustration. Nathan stomped around, gathering wet branches for a fire that would not catch muttering curses into the misty air. Shannon huddled in her damp sleeping bag, arms wrapped around her knees, listening to the sound of the creek and wishing she were anywhere else. When night finally swallowed them, they sat in the dark, shivering and silent, each lost in their own regrets about the choices that had brought them there. When dawn broke, it was a pale, ghostly light that filtered through the mist, offering no warmth or comfort to the soaked and shivering group. Nathan woke, first blinking grit from his eyes, feeling his back ache from the cold ground. He sat up and looked around at the others who lay huddled and silent in their damp sleeping bags. Jasmine was checking on Eric, who had barely slept, his face drawn and eyes bloodshot from pain. Shannon sat up slowly, brushing wet hair from her face, eyes wide and empty as she tried to make sense of another day in the wilderness that was starting with no clear plan. The cold was cruel and seemed to creep into their bones, making fingers stiff and slow as they packed their gear without speaking. They tried to light another fire, but the wood was too wet and the air too damp to catch, so they ate dry protein bars that stuck in their throats and sipped the last of their water from grimy bottles. Jasmine frowned at the dwindling supplies, knowing Eric needed rest and warmth, not another day of limping along the creek bed. Nathan avoided her gaze and kept folding the ruined map, smoothing it uselessly as though willing it to reveal something that would save them. Shannon wiped at her nose and stared at the water rushing by her teeth, chattering so hard she had to bite her lip to keep quiet. The silence among them was heavy and angry, full of unspoken blame. They forced themselves to move, knowing that staying in one spot without food or fire would kill them just as surely as getting lost. Eric leaned heavily on Jasmine while Nathan tried to clear a path ahead, moving branches and slipping on wet stones with curses that cracked in the cold air. Shannon followed last, fighting the urge to just sit down and let the forest swallow her. Her eyes kept darting to the trees, half hoping and half dreading that she might see those mysterious lights again. The creek noise roared in their ears, making conversation almost impossible, which suited them all just fine because none of them felt like talking anymore. Each step was a small victory, but the growing ache in their bodies made the progress feel meaningless. Halfway through the morning, they stopped to rest on a slick boulder beside the water. Eric could go no farther for the moment, gasping and pale with sweat on his brow despite the cold. Jasmine checked his ankle again and winced at the sight of the ugly swelling that refused to go down. She looked up at Nathan with pure exasperation, her voice cracking as she said he needed real help. Nathan clenched his fists and turned away, blaming himself silently for everything. Shannon sat nearby, hugging her knees, listening to them argue without really hearing the words, just the frustration and fear in their voices. She tried to tell herself they would make it out if they just kept moving, but her stomach churned with doubt. As they sat there, Eric confessed in a voice so low they almost missed it that he had not registered their planned route with the ranger station before they left. He admitted he did not want to pay the extra fee and figured they would be fine without it. Jasmine felt her face flush hot despite the cold anger rising in her chest like bile as she realized no one even knew where they were supposed to be. Nathan looked stricken but said nothing, knowing that his plan to take the unmarked trail had been the real mistake. Shannon turned away, covering her face with her hands, trying not to cry in front of them as the crushing weight of that admission settled over the group. They tried to keep going after that, but the mood was ruined beyond repair. Jasmine kept a hand on Eric as they moved while Nathan led with mechanical determination, not looking back at the others. Shannon stumbled along behind her feet, numb and heavy, her mind a blur of exhaustion and terror she refused to speak aloud. They climbed over fallen logs and skirted pools of standing water, fighting branches that grabbed at their clothes like cold fingers. At one point they paused as Shannon shrieked in sudden hope. She had seen a faint bar of signal on her phone screen. With shaking fingers, she typed a frantic text to her sister in Spokane, but the message went through garbled before the battery died completely. She slumped to the ground, sobbing, the others watching her without knowing what to say or do. As afternoon settled into a gray and heavy silence, they chose a place to stop for the night. They did not bother trying to find the perfect spot, just a stretch of semi-dry ground out of the water's reach. Eric collapsed with relief, groaning in pain, while Jasmine did her best to comfort him. Nathan dropped his pack and sat with his head in his hands, the failure of leadership pressing on him like a physical weight. Shannon sat cross-legged, arms folded tight around her body, rocking slightly and whispering to herself that it would all be okay, even though she did not believe it anymore. The wind sighed through the trees above them, making the branches creak like old bones. And somewhere an owl hooted a lonely call into the growing dark. They woke to a new day that offered no hope, only more gray skies and the ceaseless chill of wet clothes clinging to chilled skin. Nathan sat up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in his back and shoulders, feeling every mile they had fought through mud and rain. Jasmine was already awake and checking on Eric, who lay on his side with eyes closed, breathing shallow and ragged sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Shannon curled in her sleeping bag as tightly as she could, trying to squeeze out the last bit of warmth and ignoring the tears that slid down her nose and mixed with the rain. No one spoke for a long time. Words felt pointless, as heavy and useless as the packs that sat on the muddy ground beside them. They forced themselves to eat something, chewing dry bars without tasting them, washing it down with the last of the water they had collected in a cracked plastic bottle filled with muddy runoff. Jasmine worried about Eric's worsening condition, watching the ugly black and purple swelling that had spread further up his leg. She knew infection was a real risk, and there was nothing she could do to stop it without supplies they no longer had. Nathan kept avoiding her eyes, staring into the distance as though willing the trees to part and reveal a roaded trail, any sign of rescue. Shannon refused to meet anyone's gaze, clutching her bag like it was a shield against the reality pressing in on all sides. They packed in silence, movements slow and clumsy from the cold that had settled into their bones. Eric groaned when they tried to help him up, his face twisted with pain and humiliation. Jasmine insisted they rest longer, but Nathan shook his head and said they could not stay here forever, even though the words sounded hollow even to him. They managed to get Eric standing, leaning heavily on Jasmine and Nathan both, while Shannon took the lead, eyes scanning the underbrush for any sign of the creek they hoped would guide them. The air was damp and heavy-smelling of wet leaves and the slow rot of fallen logs. Every step a squelch of mud underfoot that threatened to swallow their boots. By midday they stopped, too exhausted to continue. Eric collapsed onto a patch of flattened grass, his breathing ragged as Jasmine knelt to check his pulse, and his ankle shaking her head at the state of both. Nathan wandered a few yards away, pretending to scout, but really just trying to hide the tears that threatened to spill from sheer frustration and helplessness. Shannon sat with her back to a tree, staring blankly at the canopy above that swayed and groaned in the cold wind, feeling more alone than she ever had in her life. They did not speak except for Jasmine's quiet muttering to Eric, trying to soothe him even as she fought her own fear rising in her throat. Late in the afternoon, the rain returned with renewed force, cold needles that drove them to huddle under a makeshift shelter of branches and their emergency blanket. It was not enough. Water dripped through the cracks, pooling on the ground beneath them, soaking everything they had managed to keep dry until then. Eric shivered uncontrollably despite their body heat pressed close around him, and Jasmine held him tight, whispering soft nonsense words to keep him from slipping into delirium. Nathan sat with his head resting on his knees, arms folded tight around them, feeling utterly defeated. Shannon closed her eyes and imagined her classroom, the smell of crayons and children laughing, willing herself to remember warmth. As darkness fell, the wind howled through the trees like a living thing, rattling branches and sending loose pine needles flying. They sat awake in the dark, too cold and wet to sleep, listening to Eric's labored breathing and the relentless drumming of rain on their flimsy shelter. Jasmine wept quietly where she thought no one could hear, pressing her face to Eric's shoulder and feeling the fever burning through his skin. Nathan tried to say something to comfort her, but his voice broke and he stopped words dying in his throat. Shannon stared wide-eyed into the blackness, counting each breath she took to remind herself she was still alive. Every sound outside felt like a threat waiting for the right moment to strike. The ground shuddered under them with a muffled groan they at first thought was thunder, but then realized was the earth itself. Heavy rain had saturated the hillside above, and without warning a low rumble grew into a roar as mud and rocks broke free. They scrambled to their feet in panic, but there was nowhere to run. A wave of wet earth crashed through their shelter, knocking them flat and burying their supplies in a thick, suffocating mass. Jasmine screamed Eric's name as she felt him wrenched from her arms. Nathan fought to pull himself free, his arms slick with mud, lungs burning with effort. Shannon tumbled backward, hitting her head on a rock and blinking in stunned confusion as the world turned black. Nathan coughed mud from his mouth as he clawed himself free of the wet earth that had buried him up to his chest. Every muscle in his body shook from the effort, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He wiped at his face with shaking hands, smearing mud across his eyes, blinking wildly as he tried to make sense of the chaos around him. The world was a mess of uprooted branches, torn shelter fabric, and a brown slurry that swallowed anything left behind. He shouted for the others until his throat-burned voice cracking in terror and frustration, but the only answer was the patter of continuing rain and the distant rumble of settling earth. He forced himself up on his knees, scanning the wreckage with growing panic, knowing they had no time to lose if anyone was buried alive nearby. Jasmine groaned in pain, pushing herself up with one arm while the other cradled her ribs. She had been thrown hard against a boulder when the mudslide hit, and every breath sent sharp pain lancing through her chest. She blinked through tears of pain and mud, trying to orient herself, ears ringing with the roar of the earth that had swallowed their camp. She could not see Eric anywhere, and her stomach turned to ice as she realized he had been torn from her arms. She tried to call for him, but her voice came out a strangled rasp. She forced herself to crawl, pulling at debris with shaking hands, mud soaking her clothes and caking in her hair, her heart hammering in her chest with dread. Shannon lay crumpled on the edge of the slide zone, dazed from the blow to her head that had left a trickle of blood down her temple. She opened her eyes slowly, everything spinning shapes, blurring and shifting in the dim pre-dawn light. She tasted copper in her mouth and spat weakly, trying to remember what had happened. The world felt unreal distant, the cold and wet pressing in on her like a heavy weight. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself upright, clutching at a fallen branch for balance. Her vision cleared enough to see the path of destruction the slide had carved through the forest, a brown wound through green. She heard Nathan yelling, and felt the stab of terror as she realized Jasmine was screaming Eric's name somewhere below her. Jasmine found Eric half buried against a fallen log, his leg twisted grotesquely, mud caked over his mouth and nose. She let out a ragged cry and lunged forward, digging with frantic hands, pulling mud from his face and trying to clear his airway. His eyes fluttered but did not open, and his chest moved in small, shallow jerks that sent new terror stabbing through her heart. She pressed her ear to his chest, feeling the weak, erratic beat, and sobbed with relief that he was still alive. Nathan stumbled over, falling to his knees beside them, hands joining hers to dig him free. Their fingers bled as they tore at the wet earth, cursing and crying and whispering desperate encouragements. Shannon staggered over last, falling beside them and pushing with what strength she had left. They finally pulled Eric free enough to move him, but the damage was clear. His leg was a ruined mess of bone and torn flesh, and his breathing was wet and raspy blood at the corner of his mouth. Jasmine pressed her hand to his chest, feeling the fever that burned through him, the infection now undeniable. Eric coughed weakly, eyes fluttering as he tried to focus, lips moving in slurred, broken words they could not understand. Jasmine pressed her forehead to his, whispering over and over that they would get him out, that he had to stay with them. Nathan looked away, shoulders shaking, refusing to let them see the tears that filled his eyes. Shannon wiped at her face, smearing blood and mud alike, staring with hollow eyes that could no longer pretend they would be okay. They made a hasty stretcher from branches and the shredded remains of their tarp, tying it together with whatever scraps of rope and fabric they could salvage. It was crude and unstable, but it was all they had. Nathan and Jasmine lifted Eric carefully, wincing as he let out a ragged moan of pain, his eyes rolling back in his head. Shannon followed behind, stumbling through the mud, carrying their dwindling supplies in a ripped pack slung over her shoulder. The rain continued to fall in a steady, miserable drizzle, turning the forest floor to slick muck that threatened to swallow their boots with every step. They had no plan except to move downhill, hoping they would find the creek again, praying it would lead them somewhere with help. They traveled in silence, broken only by Eric's labored breathing and the occasional snap of branches as they fought through the underbrush. Nathan grunted with the weight of the stretcher muscles, screaming with exhaustion that went bone deep. Jasmine moved with mechanical precision, refusing to let go, even when her grip slipped and tore her palms raw. Shannon stumbled behind them, eyes glazed, muttering to herself as she fought the urge to simply sit down and never get up again. The forest felt endless, indifferent to their suffering, the towering trees watching in silent judgment as they dragged themselves forward. The weight of their failure pressed on them all, a silent truth they carried along with Eric's broken body. The morning light barely filtered through the thick canopy as they struggled on every step, sinking into mud that threatened to trap them forever. Nathan's arms trembled with effort, his grip slipping on the rough branches of the stretcher they had pieced together. Jasmine's hair hung in wet strands across her face, eyes red and puffy from tears she refused to let fall now. Eric moaned weakly, with each jolt of movement, his breathing a wet rattle that cut through the forest's grim silence. Shannon trudged behind them, clutching the tattered remains of their supplies with white-knuckled fingers, lips moving in a constant whisper of words that sounded like prayer or pleading. They chose a route that angled downhill, hoping it would eventually lead them to the creek they had lost in the dark chaos of the slide. Every 100 yards they had to stop and rest, gasping for air in the heavy, humid morning, while Eric's shallow breaths seemed to fade and return in terrifying cycles. Jasmine pressed her fingers to his neck at every stop, feeling for the flutter of a pulse that felt weaker each time. Nathan kept staring ahead, refusing to look at Jasmine, or Shannon, eyes locked on the way forward, even when it disappeared behind curtains of hanging moss and walls of tangled brush. At one point, they reached a fallen tree too big to climb over with Eric's weight. Nathan swore under his breath and set the stretcher down so hard Eric let out a strangled cry. Jasmine turned on him with rage in her eyes, striking his chest with an open hand before collapsing into sobs. Nathan stood rigid, jaw clenching and unclenching as he struggled not to break down himself. Shannon watched them both with blank eyes, swaying on her feet before turning away and vomiting into the mud. For a moment, they all froze, the sounds of retching and sobbing filling the forest like a cruel joke of life in the wilderness. They managed to drag Eric around the obstacle, pulling the stretcher sideways over slick ground, falling and crawling and scraping themselves raw. Jasmine whispered apologies to Eric each time they had to jolt him, voice cracking with exhaustion and grief. Nathan refused to meet her gaze, keeping his eyes on the trail, but his hands shook so badly he could barely grip the stretcher. Shannon fell once, and lay there for what felt like minutes before they yelled at her to get up, her voice coming out in a wail of despair that was swallowed by the trees. They pressed on anyway because stopping felt like dying, even if moving felt the same. The afternoon brought a change in the air, a tension that settled in their chests and made every breath harder. The forest went unnaturally quiet. No birds calling, no insects buzzing, just the labored breathing of the three who could still stand. They barely noticed the ground underfoot turning softer, spongier until Nathan took a step that plunged him knee-deep in black muck. He froze, eyes wide with fear, as the mud sucked at his leg, refusing to let go. Jasmine tried to help, but her own foot sank in up to the ankle, pulling her off balance. Shannon screamed as she realized the whole clearing was a hidden bog, a death trap waiting for the exhausted and unwary. They fought to free themselves, twisting and heaving, grunting in terror as the mud dragged them deeper with every movement. The stretcher tipped and Eric rolled limply to the side, half in the muck face turned up and eyes glassy with fevered confusion. Jasmine lunged for him, grabbing his arm and pulling with everything she had, mud filling her sleeves and creeping up to her elbows. Nathan heaved himself free with a roar of effort and grabbed Jasmine around the waist, hauling her back even as she screamed not to leave Eric. Shannon stood on the edge, arms outstretched, crying that she could not help them, voice cracking as she shook with helpless fear. They managed to drag Eric back onto more solid ground, but he was barely conscious, mumbling incoherently, his breath a wet rattle that sounded like the forest itself was choking him. Jasmine wiped at his face with filthy hands, smearing mud and tears across his feverish skin, begging him to stay with them. Nathan turned away, chest-heaving, eyes squeezed shut as he pressed his knuckles into his mouth to keep from screaming. Shannon sat on the ground with her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking back and forth and humming tunelessly, mind fracturing under the weight of fear and failure. They sat there for what felt like hours, rain dripping in fitful spits from the canopy above, thunder grumbling in the distance like a promise of more misery to come. Jasmine's hands shook uncontrollably as she checked Eric's pulse, feeling it flutter and pause in ways that made her stomach twist with dread. Nathan finally forced himself to speak, voice low and broken, telling them they had to keep moving before night fell again and trapped them in the dark. Shannon did not answer, only stared at the ground with blank eyes that no longer registered what was happening around her. They tried to lift Eric again, but his body hung limp, heavier than before, breath rattling so badly it seemed to gurgle with each exhale. Jasmine sobbed openly now, clutching him to her chest, rocking him gently like a mother with a sick child. Nathan placed a hand on her shoulder, but she shook him off violently, glaring with red-rimmed eyes that burned with fury and grief. Shannon finally looked up and let out a single hollow laugh that turned into a sob, covering her mouth with shaking hands. The forest watched them with unblinking indifference, the trees offering no shelter, no mercy, only the endless repetition of rain and silence. They woke the next morning in a fog so thick they could not see more than a few feet ahead. The forest felt close, and suffocating branches dripping cold water onto their heads as they tried to remember why they should keep going at all. Nathan sat with his knees drawn up to his chest, arms wrapped tight around them, eyes dull and unfocused as he stared at the muddied ground. Jasmine lay next to Eric, one arm draped over his chest as though she could keep him warm with her own body heat. His breathing had slowed to a weak rasp, each exhale sounding wet and fragile, the infection unchecked and raging. Shannon sat apart from them both, rocking slowly, arms hugging her sides as she mumbled words no one else could hear. The silence between them was heavier than the mist, broken only by the occasional cough from Eric that made Jasmine flinch every time. She wiped at his face with the last clean scrap of fabric she had, smearing mud and tears alike, as she whispered soft apologies and pleas for him to stay with them. Nathan finally forced himself to his feet, joints cracking with stiffness, muscles screaming from days of abuse. He looked at them and tried to speak, but the words died in his throat, choked off by the truth they all felt pressing down. They were lost alone, and no one was coming. They had been missing long enough that search teams had already scoured the most obvious routes and declared them lost to the wilderness. Eric's failure to register their planned trail meant no one knew where they had really gone. The ranger station recorded their departure, but with no itinerary on file, the official search had focused on popular paths and marked routes. Volunteers combed easy ground for days, calling their names into canyons and riverbeds that echoed their voices back with cruel indifference. When nothing turned up, the efforts shifted to theory and speculation. Some guessing they had turned back toward town, others that they had tried a shortcut and been swept into the river. Families back home made calls that went unanswered, leaving voicemails that would never be heard. Nathan's parents left desperate messages on his cell phone that lay dead and forgotten at the bottom of his pack. Jasmine's mother sat awake all night in Sacramento, staring at the wall and flinching at every ring of the phone, praying each time it would be her daughter's voice. Shannon's father tried to organize his own search with friends from Spokane, but found himself blocked by distance money and bureaucratic red tape that cared little for urgency. Eric's family called the ranger station daily, growing angrier and more desperate with every polite but empty answer. As days turned into a week, the search lost momentum. Volunteers had jobs to return to. Rangers had other responsibilities, and the world outside the forest kept moving. Newspapers ran a small story about 4 missing hikers in the Cascades, but interest faded when there was nothing dramatic to report. The families begged for helicopters, dogs, more resources, but budgets were thin, and the area was too vast. Rumors spread that the group had been reckless, that they had ignored warnings that they were probably dead and buried under rock or mud where no one would find them. Even those who cared began to accept that the mountains had claimed them like so many before. Back in the forest, the group pressed on through the mist, dragging the stretcher with lifeless determination, every muscle screaming with pain. Eric drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling nonsense and crying out for people who were not there. Jasmine hushed him with cracked lips and trembling hands, lying to him in whispers that help was close, that he would see home again. Nathan pulled the stretcher with raw, bleeding palm's teeth, gritted so hard his jaw throbbed. Shannon walked behind them, barely aware of her feet, moving eyes glassy and unfocused, as she whispered to herself about classrooms and crayons and children who would never see her again. They stopped often, too exhausted to keep up any real pace, their clothes hanging from them in wet tatters, skin rubbed raw where fabric chafed against mud-caked flesh. When they rested, Jasmine tried to feed Eric sips of filthy water collected from puddles, but he choked and gagged, unable to swallow. Nathan sat with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs he refused to let them hear. Shannon would wander a few feet away and stand staring at nothing, her lips moving in silent conversation with ghosts only she could see. The forest loomed around them, ancient and silent, bearing witness without mercy. By late afternoon they came to another steep descent, a slope slick with mud and covered in tangled roots. Nathan cursed under his breath and turned to Jasmine, voice cracking as he told her they could not carry Eric down safely. She shook her head wildly, refusing to hear it, insisting they had to keep going. Eric moaned at the sound of their voices, trying to turn his head but too weak to lift it. Shannon sat down at the top of the slope and refused to move, staring at the ground with dead eyes. Nathan dropped the stretcher and buried his face in his hands, the sound of his sobs finally escaping into the damp, uncaring air. The cold settled into their bones with an unrelenting persistence that felt like a curse spoken by the forest itself. Nathan sat on the muddy slope with his knees pulled tight to his chest while his eyes were fixed on the ground in front of him. His breath came in ragged shudders that did nothing to clear the fog of exhaustion in his mind. Jasmine knelt beside Eric, who lay limp on the battered stretcher they had dragged through miles of wet earth and tangled roots. Her hands rested on his chest, as though she could feel the life slowly draining away with every failing breath. Shannon crouched at the edge of the clearing with her arms hugging her torso while she rocked in small jerky motions. Her gaze remained distant and unfocused, as if she was no longer capable of seeing the ruined forest around them. Eric made a sound that was half cough and half plea, as bubbles of blood flecked his lips. Jasmine jerked her head up at the noise and wiped at his mouth with trembling fingers, leaving smears of mud streaked with red. She whispered soft nonsense words to him, even though her voice cracked and fell away under the weight of her sobs. Nathan rubbed his face with dirty hands and felt the grit scrape his skin until it stung as he forced himself to focus. He knew what Jasmine wanted him to say, but the words would not come. He felt hollowed out and useless as the leader he had pretended to be when they first set out. The trees loomed over them with indifferent silence as the wind rustled wet branches and sent showers of cold droplets onto their heads. They had no fire left to light, no food left to eat, no dry clothes to change into. Every option had been stripped away by the slide, the mud, the cold, and the miles they should never have tried to cross. Nathan watched Jasmine press her forehead to Eric's and realized she was praying even though he had never known her to talk about faith. He blinked away tears that stung in the cold air and turned his head away to stare at the line of the creek they had lost and found so many times it had become a cruel joke. Eric's breathing hitched and stopped for a long moment before returning in a ragged, wet gasp. Jasmine sat bolt upright with her eyes wide as she listened to the silence between breaths stretched too long. She pressed harder on his chest, as though she could coax his heart to keep beating. She pleaded with him in a voice so broken it barely sounded human. Nathan finally moved closer and rested a hand on her shoulder, but she shook him off violently and let out a howl of grief that echoed off the trees and returned to them warped and empty. Shannon did not move or flinch at the sound as she stared at the ground and whispered a litany of names from home that only she could hear. They sat there in the wet mud long after Eric's chest stopped moving. Jasmine curled over his body with her hair falling like a curtain around them as she sobbed into his torn jacket. Nathan lowered his head and let the tears run freely down his face until they mingled with the rain and disappeared into the ground. Shannon eventually lifted her head to look at the scene, but her eyes seemed to register nothing as she let out a small sound that was neither laugh nor sob, but something broken between the two. The wind picked up and rustled the forest with a sound like whispers mocking their failure. Nathan eventually whispered that they could not stay there forever, but his voice was so weak he was not sure Jasmine even heard him. She stayed bent over Eric with her shoulders shaking in silent sobs that left her gasping for air. He tried again, and this time she looked up with eyes so full of rage and grief that he flinched. She asked him what he wanted to do, leave him here like trash for the animals to find. Nathan had no answer because he knew she was right. Shannon watched them with empty eyes and muttered that nothing mattered anymore. Eventually, they managed to gather enough strength to move Eric's body off the stretcher and lay him gently in the crook of a massive tree root that jutted from the slope like a cradle. Jasmine arranged her arms over his chest with hands that shook so badly she dropped them more than once. Nathan tried to help, but she slapped his hands away and told him she could do it herself. Shannon stood back and rocked on her heels with her arms wrapped around her thin frame. When Jasmine was done, she pressed her lips to Eric's forehead and whispered something none of them heard, before letting out a final sob and standing up slowly like an old woman who had forgotten how to move. Nathan cleared away branches and wet leaves to cover Eric as best he could with shaking hands that felt useless and clumsy. Jasmine watched him with hollow eyes and eventually helped by laying pine boughs across his legs and chest. Shannon picked up handfuls of mud and dribbled them over his feet without a word or expression. When they were finished, the shape of him was still there, but softened by green and brown until it was part of the forest itself. Nathan said he was sorry over and over with his voice cracking until Jasmine turned away and put her hands over her ears. They did not speak for a long time after that. They sat in the wet mud and listened to the rain fall like the ticking of a clock that had run out of time. Nathan eventually stood and picked up what was left of their supplies, which was hardly anything at all. Jasmine wiped her eyes on her filthy sleeve and helped Shannon to her feet, even though the other woman barely seemed to notice. They looked at the shape of Eric one last time before they turned away. Nathan led them downhill because there was nothing else to do, and the slope seemed to suggest a way out, even if they did not believe in one anymore. They moved like ghosts through the trees with their feet dragging and clothes plastered to their skin. Shannon began to mumble again about her classroom and the children waiting for her to come back. Jasmine clutched her arms around herself and kept looking back over her shoulder at the shape of the grave they had made. Nathan did not look back at all. He kept his eyes on the ground in front of him as if the forest might finally take pity on them and show them a way out if he just walked long enough. As the rain finally eased into a mist, the forest seemed to sigh around them like it was done with them at last. They did not know if they would make it out, but they kept moving because stopping felt like betrayal to the one they had left behind. Jasmine whispered that she would tell his family what had happened, even if they never believed her. Nathan promised in a cracked voice that he would never again ignore a warning sign or take a risk with someone else's life. Shannon promised nothing at all, but she began to hum a tune she used to sing to her students. If you found this story moving or thought-provoking, please take a moment to like and subscribe for more narratives like this one. Share your thoughts about the plot in the comments and let us know where you are watching from. Your feedback helps us bring you more of the stories you want to hear.